the ground that would not stay silent. The spring air was heavy that morning, warm for March yet carrying the faintest bite of winter's memory. A tenant farmer named Elijah Harper guided his plow horse across a patch of stubborn soil near the Delaware-Maryland border. The earth had always resisted him here, a knotted patch of ground where roots tangled like coiled snakes. But this time the resistance gave way with a sickening collapse. The horse shuddered and lurched as one hoof sank deep into the ground. Elijah cursed, tugged the reins, and bent down to see what had betrayed the earth beneath him. What he unearthed would not only split the soil but would split the history of the region wide open. For beneath that ground was a box, a coffin, though not one ever lowered with prayer. Inside lay bones, yellowed with age, arranged like a grotesque puzzle. The skull bore the unmistakable fracture of violence. A man had been buried here not with respect, but with secrecy. What Elijah did not yet know, what no man in Sussex County truly wanted to believe, was that the earth at Johnson's Crossroads was full of such secrets. This discovery was not an isolated horror but a doorway, and once opened, that door would not easily be closed. For buried in the tangled roots of the Delmarva Peninsula was the story of a woman whose name, whispered even then, made children hush their laughter and neighbors bolt their shutters at night. Martha Patty Cannon, the crossroads of shadows. The land where Delaware met Maryland was, by all appearances, nothing remarkable. Low fields stretched into pine, forest, the trees whispering in winds that carried salt from the nearby Nanticoke River. But this quiet countryside sat atop a fault line, not of geology, but of law. Here 3 counties rubbed together, their boundaries blurred by surveyors' disputes and outdated maps. One wrong step and you were no longer in Sussex County, Delaware, but in Caroline or Dorchester County, Maryland. For criminals, it was paradise. Step across the invisible line, and justice fell apart like wet paper. It was here that Patty Cannon built her empire. Johnson's Crossroads, locals called it, a lonely junction where a tavern stood like a sentinel. To the thirsty, it was a resting place. To the lost, it was salvation. But to the many who vanished along these roads, it was a snare. At first, neighbors thought little of Patty Cannon. She was a farmer's wife, tall, unnaturally so, nearly 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a voice that could silence a room. Some whispered that her husband Jesse had married a woman half a man taller than himself and half a demon meaner. He was quiet, his farm modest. Nothing about the Cannons should have drawn notice, yet people did notice, for Patty radiated something that unsettled even the bluntest of neighbors. They noticed how her eyes lingered too long, as though weighing men like cattle. They noticed how her temper struck like summer lightning, sudden and without warning. And they noticed, though few dared say it aloud, that strange wagons came and went at night. The market of flesh. To understand Patty's rise, one must first understand the hunger of the South. In 1808, Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans. But the ban only raised prices. A man once bought for $300 now fetched more than $1,000 in Alabama or Georgia. Demand exploded with the cotton gin's invention, and with it temptation. The Delmarva Peninsula was ripe for exploitation. Here lived a large population of free black families, men and women who had carved fragile independence from the land after the Revolution. They worked as artisans, sailors, farmers, and laborers. They built churches. They raised children who had never known chains. But their freedom rested on paper documents, easily lost, stolen, or destroyed. And in a society that already viewed their lives as lesser, their disappearances rarely stirred more than a shrug from white officials. Patty Cannon saw opportunity in this imbalance. She saw human beings not as neighbors but as currency. With her son-in-law Joseph Johnson, a man with Southern contacts and a tavern positioned like a spider's web at the state line, she wove what would later be called the Reverse Underground Railroad. Her gang kidnapped the free. They lured children with promises of work. They ambushed men on lonely roads. They snatched women while their husbands labored in fields. And always, the captives were hidden, in cellars with iron rings sunk into stone, in wagons with false bottoms, in rooms where the windows were bricked shut. Neighbors heard rumors, of course. Whispers of children vanishing on the road to Seaford, of mothers searching for sons who had left for employment and never returned. But rumors were like smoke, impossible to catch, easy to ignore. A widow's transformation, Jesse Cannon, Patty's husband, died in 1826 under circumstances that even the most polite neighbors could not call natural. Some said he wasted away, poisoned slowly. Others claimed Patty had struck him down in a fit of rage. However he died, one thing was clear. His passing freed Patty, not from grief but from restraint. Now the Cannon homestead was hers. The barns, the fields, the hidden cellars, and the tavern across the way, run by her son-in-law Johnson, became the perfect mask. Its rooms straddled the state line. A guest could fall asleep in Delaware and wake in Maryland simply by crossing the hallway. To lawmen, jurisdiction was a wall. To Patty, it was a door she walked through laughing. Johnson's tavern was a beacon to travelers, slave traders, merchants, families moving south. Legitimate guests shared the space with shackled captives locked below, their cries muffled by pine beams and earth. Above ground, mugs clinked and fiddles played. Below, chains scraped and children whimpered. This was Patty's kingdom, and she ruled it not with secrecy alone but with blood. The first murder crime has a way of testing its own boundaries. For years, Patty and her gang trafficked in kidnappings, but opportunity brought escalation. In 1811, her daughter's husband, Henry Brighton, already notorious as a kidnapper, was caught and jailed. He escaped, returned to Patty, and within months, blood was spilled. Their victim was a man named Rigel, a slave trader from the South. He carried cash, thousands of dollars, to buy enslaved people. Rigel stopped at Cannon's tavern, thinking himself among business partners. Instead, he was fed liquor until he swayed, robbed, shot, and buried on the property. His horses vanished into the night. His body vanished into the ground. The law caught Brighton and an accomplice. Both were hanged. But Patty remained untouchable. Witnesses claimed she orchestrated the plan, that her voice guided the murder. Yet in court, her name slid away like water through fingers. She returned home, unshaken, her eyes gleaming with the lesson learned. Murder was not an obstacle. It was an instrument. The face of fear. What kind of woman was Patty Cannon? Contemporary accounts paint her in strokes both vivid and unsettling. She was described as tall, broad, with hands that could snap a man's jaw. She smoked a pipe, drank whiskey neat, and carried herself with the authority of someone who had never known fear. Children in nearby towns whispered her name as if invoking a ghost. Parents warned their little ones, "Stay close or Patty Cannon will come for you." But her menace was not just physical. She knew how to break spirits. Victims were stripped of papers, renamed, their identities dissolved like sugar in boiling water. She fed them lies. You were never free. Your family sold you. No one will come for you. For many, hope died before the journey south even began. Her cruelty was pragmatic. Infants who cried too loudly were silenced permanently. Boys who resisted too fiercely disappeared. Even her partners feared her. Yet they followed, for her empire brought riches, and with each crime, with each night wagon rolling toward the river, her legend grew. The land remembers. By the 1820s, the scale of disappearances could no longer be dismissed. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, himself a Quaker, tracked free black citizens vanishing by the dozens, their trails ending at Johnson's crossroads. He offered rewards, he wrote letters, he pushed officials to act. But still, the machine rolled on, fueled by greed and protected by silence, until that morning in 1829, when Elijah Harper's plow tore open the earth. When the horse's hoof sank deep into a grave it was never meant to uncover. When the first box, the first skeleton, saw daylight again, Elijah staggered back, bile rising in his throat, the wind carrying the sharp tang of rot even from bones long emptied of flesh. And as he stumbled for the sheriff, the land whispered its secret. There are more, so many more. The investigation would begin. The soil would yield its dead, and the name Paddy Cannon, already feared, would soon become synonymous with terror. But what no one yet knew, not Elijah, not the sheriff, not even Paddy herself, was that her own house of shadows was about to collapse, and the ghosts she had buried would not go quietly. The first coffin is unearthed. Authorities are alerted. But as neighbors gather, peering into the gaping wound in the soil, whispers spread. This is only the beginning. The ground is full of the dead, and every shovelful of dirt threatens to expose not only Paddy's crimes, but the complicity of a community that turned its head for far too long. The tavern that sat on two states, the uneasy earth. The crowd gathered in silence as the sheriff's men pried open the soil a second time. The smell that rose was faint, a sour whisper of something that should have long vanished but refused to rest. A child's shoe, leather curled and brittle, tumbled from the dirt. No one spoke. Elijah Harper wiped his brow with a trembling hand. He had seen death before, but not like this. Not bones hiding in the belly of his own field. Not the tiny shoe that seemed to accuse the living with mute finality. He glanced at Sheriff Joseph Houston, a man known for steady nerves. Even Houston looked pale, his lips pressed tight. "Keep digging," the sheriff ordered, though his voice cracked. Men obeyed. Spades bit earth, turning up not one set of bones but several. One box, then another, stacked in the ground like ledgers recording debts never meant to be paid. Each unearthed coffin was a testimony, and each testimony pointed to the same name, Paddy Cannon. But proof against her was never simple. The soil gave bones. The law required stories. And so the sheriff began the grim work of collecting voices. Sheriff Joseph Houston had lived his whole life in Sussex County, watching its pine forests sway like black-green waves against the sky. He knew the people here, their silences, their superstitions, their stubborn ways. But he had also known fear, and he recognized it now in the way men avoided his eyes. To accuse Paddy Cannon outright was dangerous. She was not simply a widow living by the border. She was a matriarch of a network, her reach long, her secrets many. And worse, she commanded loyalty. Tavern keepers, wagoners, even neighbors owed her debts or shared in her profits. To speak against her was to risk more than ridicule, yet here were the bones demanding words. Houston decided he would start not with the neighbors, too frightened, too compromised, but with the outcasts, those who had little left to lose. That decision would lead him to Lydia Smith. Lydia's story. Lydia had been 25 when they took her. She remembered the sound of wagon wheels first, a creak on the road behind her as she walked home from washing clothes near the river. Then hands rough, too many to fight. A rag tied across her mouth. Darkness. She woke beneath wood and earth. For weeks she lived in a cellar that smelled of damp stone, iron, and unwashed bodies. She learned quickly not to cry. Crying brought the pipe smoke breath of Paddy Cannon herself, who would descend with curses and blows. But Lydia also remembered something else. The tavern. She had been moved there after months underground, chained in a hidden chamber where voices echoed through the floorboards above. She heard fiddles, laughter, glasses clinking. And once, when the door opened to bring food, she saw the trick. One wall painted in Maryland colors, the opposite marked for Delaware. "A house in 2 states," she whispered now to Sheriff Houston, her voice shaking even in the safety of his office. "They told me if lawmen came from one side, I'd be marched across to the other, and no court could touch them." Houston listened, each word tightening the knot in his chest. Lydia spoke of chains bolted into beams, of names stripped away, of children crying in darkness. Her testimony matched the bones they had begun to pull from Cannon's soil. But Lydia offered more. She named others, wagoners, decoys, buyers in the south, and always at the center, the towering figure of Paddy, pipe in hand, voice like gravel grinding. The boy named Cyrus. If Lydia provided sorrow, it was Cyrus James who gave detail sharp as a blade. Cyrus was young, barely 17 now, but his story stretched back to when he was a boy of 7, sold into Patty's household like livestock. For a decade, he had lived inside her walls, not as family, but as tool. He lured children with friendly smiles. He delivered notes that promised work. He watched, powerless, as captives were beaten, chained, silenced. Sheriff Houston met him, in a dim room lit by a single candle. Cyrus's eyes darted to the corners as though Patty herself might step from the shadows even now. "She made me do it," he whispered. "If I said no, she said she'd send me south. Said I'd never see daylight again." Houston asked about the graves. Cyrus nodded, tears cutting lines through the dirt on his cheeks. "I buried some, I know where." The sheriff's hand trembled as he set down his pen. It was one thing to find bones by chance. It was another to have a living witness who had placed them in the earth. The tavern at the Line Johnson's Tavern stood squat and wide at the crossroads, its clapboard walls weathered silver by salt air and years of wind. By day it looked almost inviting, horses tethered outside, smoke curling from the chimney. But at night lamps glowed behind curtains, and music covered the groans from beneath. Houston approached it one evening with a small band of deputies. The moment he stepped through the door, the room fell quiet. Men at the bar looked up from their mugs. A fiddle screeched to silence mid-note, and behind the counter, Patty Cannon herself appeared, pipe clenched between her teeth, eyes sharp as knives. "Sheriff," she said, voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "You've come for a drink?" Houston met her stare. "I've come for answers." For a heartbeat, the tavern held its breath. Then Patty laughed, a booming sound that rattled the rafters. "Answers? In Johnson's Tavern? You'll find nothing but ale and cards here, lawman, unless you want to join the game." Houston's gaze swept the room. Men shifted uneasily. The sheriff knew many were guilty, but guilt was not enough. He needed evidence, he needed voices, and he needed time. "Enjoy your evening," Patty said sweetly, though her eyes promised ruin. "But remember, Sheriff, every man who drinks here is a neighbor. Neighbors don't like being questioned." The deputies tugged nervously at their coats. Houston realized he was standing on the very knife edge that had protected Patty for years. The tavern straddled two states. One wrong move and she would slip into Maryland jurisdiction, untouchable. He left that night with nothing but her laughter echoing in his ears. Secrets in the soil. The excavations continued. Each day brought another grim revelation. A jawbone here, a femur there. Sometimes whole coffins surfaced intact. Once they found a necklace, cheap tin beads dulled with dirt. A farmer's wife crossed herself, whispering prayers for the soul of the child who must have worn it. But the soil gave more than bones. It gave the community a mirror. Men who had looked away now found themselves forced to look down into graves dug in their own fields. Women who had bought supplies from Patty now realized the coins had been bought with blood. Fear thickened. Some neighbors fled, wagons packed in the night. Others locked doors and prayed the sheriff's men would dig far from their own land, and all the while Patty moved about freely. She rode her horse through the village, her height towering, her presence like a shadow over the earth. She smiled at mothers clutching their children, tipped her hat to men who dared not meet her eyes. "Dig all you like," she told one neighbor in passing. "You'll find nothing I don't want you to." The whisper network. While the sheriff fought to gather evidence, whispers spread faster than law. In taverns miles away, men muttered of disappearances in Philadelphia traced southward. In Maryland towns, farmers spoke of wagons rolling through at night with muffled cries inside. Mayor Joseph Watson's letters arrived, stern and insistent, demanding that Delaware officials explain why free black citizens of Pennsylvania vanished, with trails ending at Patty Cannon's doorstep. For the first time, pressure came not just from frightened locals, but from neighboring states. This was no longer a local problem. It was a scandal. Patty's network felt the strain. Some of her accomplices vanished, taking what profit they could southward. Others turned on one another, murmuring deals with lawmen in exchange for protection. Houston sensed the cracks forming. But would they widen before Patty struck again? A night by the river Cyrus James led Houston's men to the river one gray morning. The Nanticoke flowed wide and slow, its surface dull as lead under cloud. "She used this," Cyrus said softly, pointing to a hidden inlet choked with reeds. "Boats would wait. At night they loaded people here." The deputies searched, finding scraps, rope ends, a rusted chain, boards from a dismantled crate. Enough to suggest truth, not enough for a court. But as the sheriff turned to leave, a sound caught him, a hollow echo beneath his boots. He dropped to his knees, scraped aside reeds, and found planks. A false dock, built over ground that sank when tapped. "Here," he whispered. The men pried the boards. Beneath lay another pit, another coffin, another life erased. Houston's jaw tightened. The river itself seemed to moan, as though carrying the voices of those who had been ferried into darkness. The gathering storm by April, the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies stacked like kindling, bones piled in makeshift sheds tagged with dates and places. Letters from Philadelphia demanded justice. Maryland pressed for action. Yet Patty Cannon walked free. She laughed in her tavern, smoked her pipe, and told anyone who dared whisper that the sheriff's obsession was nothing but politics. But behind her bravado, unease grew. She had silenced many, witnesses, rivals, even children, but Cyrus had escaped her grip. Lydia had spoken, and the ground itself betrayed her. The sheriff prepared his case. A grand jury would be called. Indictments were coming, and Patty, for the first time in decades, realized the walls of jurisdiction might not be high enough. One night in late April, as rain lashed the tavern's roof, a wagon arrived, not with captives but with allies. Men stepped down, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They spoke with Patty in low voices, their eyes darting like wolves, scenting danger. Cyrus, hiding near the barn, overheard only fragments. Too many questions? Better to end it now, bury them deeper. He ran through the rain to find Sheriff Houston. By dawn, Houston's men were preparing for confrontation, but in the tavern at Johnson's Crossroads, Patty Cannon was already making plans of her own. The question was no longer whether she would be stopped. The question was, how many more would vanish before the end came? The House of Chains, the cracks in the empire. The spring rains did little to cleanse the land around Johnson's Crossroads. If anything, they turned the earth into a mirror reflecting the unease of the people who lived there. Mud sucked at boots. Trees groaned under the weight of water, and in every farmhouse whispers grew louder. Neighbors who once looked away from Patty Cannon's wagons now kept their shutters closed and their lamps dimmed, as though silence could erase memory. But silence had betrayed them before, and silence was betraying them now. Sheriff Joseph Houston felt it like static in the air. The moment before a storm breaks, he had the bones, the testimony, the outrage of Philadelphia breathing down his neck, yet still Patty walked free. Still she strode through the tavern like a queen among trembling subjects. But something had shifted. Even her own men no longer met her eyes the way they once had. Some drank harder, some disappeared entirely, and those who remained seemed more like dogs on leashes too tight, their loyalty stretched thin by fear. The empire was cracking. And Patty knew it. The queen in her tavern. Inside Johnson's tavern, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the sour tang of spilled ale. Patty sat at the long table, her hands wrapped around a mug she did not drink from. Around her, the men murmured, glancing at the door, the windows, the floorboards beneath their boots. "They're digging up more every day," one muttered. "Every box they pull makes it worse." Patty's voice cut the air like a blade. "Bones don't speak, bones don't hang me." Another shifted uneasily. "But Cyrus does. The boy knows too much." At that, Patty's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "Cyrus is mine. He's always been mine." She tapped the table with a thick finger, and anyone who thinks otherwise will end up under the same soil. But even as she spoke, she could feel it. The room no longer hummed with loyalty. It vibrated with fear, not just of her, but of the noose that now swung over all their heads. The sheriff's Ned Houston knew he could not wait for the courts alone. He needed witnesses, and he needed them alive long enough to speak. Too many had vanished before testimony could reach paper. Too many had been silenced in ditches or riverbeds. So he began moving quietly, placing guards near Lydia Smith's home, sending deputies to shadow Cyrus. He even reached into Maryland, coordinating with officials who, for once, recognized that this case was larger than borders. But every move risked exposure. The tavern's walls had ears. More than once, Houston returned to his office to find notes slid under the door, anonymous hands warning him to stop before he too was buried in Cannon's soil. Yet Houston pressed on. He had stared into the graves himself. He had seen the tiny shoe fall from the dirt. There was no turning back. Cyrus's torment. Cyrus James lived now in constant terror. Each night he dreamed of Patty's footsteps pounding the stairs above his chamber, her shadow filling the doorway, her hand reaching for the whip. He woke sweating, the memory of chains still clamped around his wrists. But worse than the dreams were the memories that returned in daylight. The faces of children he had lured, the sobs of women he had watched disappear into wagons. And always, Patty's voice rasping in his ear. "Do as I say or I'll sell you south." Even in freedom, the threat clung to him like smoke. He had never seen the deep south, but the stories were enough. Fields of endless cotton, overseers with eyes like knives, lives ground down into dust. He wanted to testify. He wanted to see her fall. But part of him still flinched at the thought of betraying her, the woman who had fed him, clothed him, beaten him, owned him. His loyalty and his hatred wrestled inside him, tearing at what little peace remained. One night, unable to sleep, he walked the edges of the fields where the bodies had been unearthed. He whispered apologies into the wind, names he barely remembered, faces already fading. The earth gave no answer. Only the river carried his words away. Lydia's burden. If Cyrus carried guilt, Lydia Smith carried rage. She spoke to Houston with fire in her eyes, telling him she would stand in court and name every crime she had seen. "They took my freedom, Sheriff, but I still have my voice. And I'll use it." But rage had its cost. Lydia lived in fear of reprisal. She slept with a knife by her bed. Each time a wagon rolled past her house, she tensed, half expecting Patty herself to come knocking, and yet she refused to flee. If I run, she wins. If I hide, she wins. I'll face her. Houston admired her courage, but he also feared it. He had seen what happened to witnesses before, and Patty, cornered, would be more dangerous than ever. Fear, murder of silence. As spring deepened into April, a new body surfaced, not from the earth but from rumor. A man who had once drunk at the tavern, known for boasting of money made running errands for Patty, was found floating in the Nanticoke River. His throat was cut, his pockets empty. The message was clear. Silence was enforced not just with threats, but with knives. Houston clenched his fists when he heard the news. Every corpse made his job harder. Every death erased another chance at testimony. But it also hardened his resolve. "This ends now," he told his deputies. "One way or another, she will face justice." The woman without fear. But Patty herself seemed untouched by the storm. She rode into town with her head held high, pipe clenched between her teeth, daring anyone to meet her gaze. When neighbors whispered about the sheriff's findings, she laughed. "Old bones," she scoffed. "Could be Indians, could be anything. You'd blame a widow for the wind if it suited you." At church, she knelt in the pew like any other, her towering frame bent in mock devotion. Mothers clutched their children tighter, but no one dared ask her to leave. It was as if she believed herself untouchable, a queen whose reign was written in fear, not paper. And in a way, she had reason. For nearly 2 decades, she had evaded law, skirted borders, silenced witnesses. Why should this time be any different? The grand jury. By late April, the grand jury convened in Georgetown. 24 white men, farmers and merchants, sat in the courthouse, their faces grave. Before them, Houston laid out the case. The bones, the testimonies, the evidence pulled from the river and the fields. Lydia Smith spoke. Her words rang through the chamber like hammer blows. She described the chains, the darkness, the children sobbing in the cellar. Cyrus spoke next. His voice faltered at times, but the details he gave, burial sites, hidden rooms, names of accomplices, painted a picture so damning no one could look away. By the end, the jury had no choice. Indictments were issued. 4 counts of murder, with more certain to follow. Patty Cannon was to be arrested. The arrest had happened on an overcast morning, the sky a dull gray blanket pressing low over the land. Sheriff Houston rode with a dozen men to Johnson's Tavern. Patty met them at the door. She wore no bonnet, her gray hair wild around her face. She smoked her pipe calmly, as though expecting them. "Sheriff," she said, her lips curling. "Come, to drink again?" "You're under arrest, Patty," Houston said, voice steady. "For murder." For a long moment, silence hung. Then Patty laughed, a deep rolling sound that shook the very walls. "Murder? You think you can hang me for murder? Do you know how many men I've buried in this soil, Sheriff? Do you know how many bones lie under your own fields?" But even as she mocked, deputies moved forward. Shackles clamped onto her wrists, chains rattling. For the first time, Patty Cannon was bound, and yet, even in chains, she smiled. "You'll never hold me," she whispered. "You don't know the half of it." The jail Patty was taken to Georgetown Jail, a crude stone building with iron bars and a damp floor. She was nearly 70 by then, yet her presence filled the cell like smoke. Guards watched her warily, as though she might bend the iron through will alone. At night she sang, low haunting tunes that echoed through the corridors, keeping other prisoners awake. Some swore they heard her laughing at shadows. When questioned, she spoke freely, too freely. She described killings with casual ease, as though discussing crops. She boasted of rivals poisoned, of children silenced, of wagons full of souls sold south. The guards listened in horror, but the confessions only strengthened the case. Still, one question remained. Would she live long enough to face trial? The poison on. The morning of May 11, 1829, guards found Patty Cannon lying on the cold stone floor of her cell. Her pipe was beside her, her lips blue. A vial, empty, was hidden in her clothing. The official record called it suicide by poison. Some whispered she had been helped, that allies smuggled arsenic to her to prevent her trial. Others believed she had planned it from the start, choosing her own death over the gallows. Whatever the truth, justice was denied. The woman who had hunted free men and women who had buried children in shallow graves had written her own ending. But her death did not erase the graves. It did not silence the ghosts. And it did not answer the question that haunted Sheriff Houston. How many more were there? The jail echoed with her laughter still, even after her body was carried out. Guards swore they heard her singing long into the night, a voice with no body to claim it. And as investigators dug deeper into her property, rumors grew darker. Some victims had not merely been murdered. Some had been buried alive. The soil was not done speaking, and neither, it seemed, was Patty Cannon. The graves still speak a death without justice. When word spread that Patty Cannon had poisoned herself in jail, the reaction across the Delmarva Peninsula was not relief, but unease. Justice had been cheated. Families who had waited years for answers, neighbors who had whispered fears in the dark, sheriffs who had prayed for a conviction, all were left hollow. Patty had chosen her own ending, leaving the gallows empty. Her chains lay coiled on the jailhouse floor, their rattling echoing long after her body was carried out. But her death did not end the nightmare. It only unshackled it. For now, with her silenced, the earth itself seemed eager to speak. The unfinished. Work Sheriff Joseph Houston stood on the Cannon property days after her death, boots sinking into the damp ground. The farmhouse loomed before him, its shutters closed, its chimney cold. Yet the place still breathed menace. Each board groaned as though it remembered screams. Each nail seemed rusted with sorrow. The excavations had paused during her arrest, but now they resumed. Deputies pried open cellars, tore up floorboards, and sank spades into gardens that should have borne corn, but instead gave up bones. And the discoveries grew worse. Not just coffins now, but signs of lives cut short mid-breath. Shallow pits where two skeletons lay tangled as though thrown in haste. Iron shackles still clamped around wrists, jawbones broken by blunt force. Houston kept a journal, each entry colder than the last. April 29th, another child, perhaps 6 years of age, found in box beneath orchard. Cause, blunt trauma to skull. May 2, remains of adult male, ribs shattered, likely buried alive. Each line of ink carved the truth deeper. Patty's empire had not been exaggeration. It had been an industry of death, the house of secrets. The farmhouse itself was a labyrinth of deception. Behind one wall, deputies found a false room, no larger than a closet, yet fitted with a single iron ring in the floor. Inside, scratch marks climbed the boards, desperate clawing that ended abruptly. In the attic, they found a trunk filled with scraps, torn papers that had once been freedom certificates burned at the edges as though deliberately destroyed. The signatures of Philadelphia magistrates were still faintly visible. Each one belonged to a free man or woman whose name was now ash. Houston ran his fingers over the charred edges, his stomach turning. The destruction had been deliberate. Erase the paper, erase the person. In Patty's world, identity was as fragile as parchment. Neighbors who toured the house during the investigation whispered that the air itself seemed cursed. Lamps blew out without reason. Doors creaked open though no wind stirred. Mothers clutched their children tighter, refusing to step beyond the threshold. It was as though the house itself had become a witness, forever testifying in groans and drafts. Cyrus's visions for Cyrus James returning to the property was unbearable. Yet Houston pressed him. No one else knew the land's secrets as he did. Cyrus walked the cellar steps with trembling legs, the shadows swallowing him whole. He could still see where children had been chained. He could still hear their cries, muffled by earth and stone. And as he stood there, memory bled into vision. For a moment he swore he saw them, pale faces in the dark, eyes wide, hands outstretched toward him. He stumbled back, choking, tears burning his eyes. "They're still here," he whispered. "She may be gone, but they're still here." Houston put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. But in his heart he wondered if Cyrus was right. The property seemed alive with echoes, and not all of them could be explained by memory. Lydia's fire, unlike Cyrus, Lydia Smith embraced the investigation with a fury that startled even the deputies. She walked the fields herself, pointing to areas she remembered from her captivity. She demanded that every box be opened, every bone counted, every scrap of cloth preserved. These were people, she said through clenched teeth, not shadows, not rumors. People. Her words cut through the numbness that threatened to consume the investigators. Each discovery was so grotesque, so numerous, that men grew desensitized. But Lydia refused to let them forget. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Lydia stood over a newly unearthed coffin. Inside lay the remains of a woman, her skull fractured, her fingers still clutching at the rotted wood. Lydia knelt, whispering words no one else could hear. When she rose, her eyes blazed. "Patty's dead," she said, "but this land is still her prison, and we are not free until every last one of them is named." The tavern turns. Cold Johnson's tavern, once alive with fiddle tunes and drunken laughter, now stood silent. Travelers avoided it, horses shying from the crossroads as though smelling rot in the air. Its walls, once a shield, now felt like gallows, beams. Inside, investigators found hidden chambers beneath the floorboards. The rooms were lined with iron rings, straw blackened with filth, and the faint scratches of fingernails dragged across stone. The deputies could not linger long. The air grew stifling as if the walls themselves exhaled sorrow. One man swore he heard voices, not loud, but murmurs like prayers whispered through the boards. Word spread quickly. By summer, locals began calling it the Tavern of Chains, and no one, Not even the bravest dared drink within its walls again. Ghosts of the law the Cannon case forced Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to face uncomfortable truths. For decades, officials had looked away, dismissing the disappearances of free black families as misfortune or wanderlust. Now the graves spoke otherwise. Newspapers printed lurid details, some exaggerated, some chillingly precise. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin and judgment. Abolitionists seized upon the revelations, declaring them proof that slavery's poison infected even free states. But for every voice demanding justice, others muttered in defense. Some neighbors insisted Patty had been framed, that the bones were ancient, unrelated. Others resented the shame cast upon their community, preferring silence to truth. The law itself struggled. Without Patty alive to stand trial, the indictments fell hollow. Her accomplices had fled south, slipping into states where jurisdiction faltered. And so, though graves filled ledgers and testimonies filled papers, punishment remained elusive. It was as if the system itself had been one of her accomplices all along. The haunting of Georgetown, even in death. Patty Cannon refused to rest quietly. Her body was buried without ceremony in the jail yard, a shallow grave dug behind stone walls. Yet guards swore they heard her laughter at night, drifting through corridors. One man claimed he saw her pipe smoke curling from the empty cell. Another swore her shadow lingered against the wall long after the lanterns were doused. Superstition spread quickly. Prisoners whispered that her spirit stalked the jail, seeking vengeance. Farmers passing at night claimed to see a tall woman, at the window, staring with eyes like burning coals. By autumn, her grave became a place of dread. Children dared each other to approach, but none lingered long. Even weeds seemed reluctant to grow there, as though the earth itself rejected her. Cyrus's choice for Cyrus. Freedom came at last when the courts recognized his testimony as coerced, his actions as those of a boy enslaved. He was given papers, protection, and a chance to leave the peninsula behind. But choice weighed heavy. He could flee north, start anew, bury the past, or he could stay, bearing witness, ensuring no one forgot what had been done. On the night of his departure, he stood at the crossroads one final time. The tavern loomed, its shutters nailed shut, its sign creaking in the wind. The farmhouse sagged in silence, its fields raw with scars of excavation. He whispered to the land, not to Patty, but to those buried within it. "I will carry your names," he said. "Even if no one else remembers, I will." Then he turned, walking toward the north, his silhouette swallowed by the horizon. Lydia's legacy, Lydia remained. She told her story again and again, in churches, in town halls, in whispered conversations with those too frightened to speak. Her words were fire, burning through the apathy that had allowed Patty's empire to flourish. Yet even Lydia was haunted. At night she dreamed of the cellar, of chains clinking in the dark. She woke to silence, but her ears still rang with cries. Still she pressed on. "If we forget," she told Houston once, "she wins again. The only weapon we have left is memory." The uneasy peace. By winter, the Cannon property was abandoned. The farmhouse rotted, the tavern sagged, the fields lay fallow. Yet no one would buy the land. Rumors claimed the soil was cursed, that crops withered, that livestock sickened. Children whispered of lights flickering in the windows at night. Hunters swore they heard chains rattling through the woods. The crossroads itself gained a new name, Reliance, as if the community hoped renaming could erase its past. But the past clung like a shadow, long and unyielding. One evening, months after Patty's death, Sheriff Houston received a letter. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged by hurried hands. It read, "Sheriff, you do not know the half of it. There are more graves, not in Delaware, not in Maryland, but farther south. She was not alone. The network stretches beyond what you imagine. What you found was only the beginning." The letter bore no signature, only a single mark drawn in black ink, the outline of a small wooden chest. Houston stared, had it long into the night, his gut twisting. Patty Cannon was dead, but the shadow of her empire was not. And somewhere beyond the borders of his jurisdiction, the reverse Underground Railroad still thrived. The question was no longer who Patty Cannon had killed. The question was, how far did her darkness reach? The Shadow Network. The Letter Sheriff. Joseph Houston kept the letter hidden in his desk for days before he dared speak of it. The handwriting was rough, the words hurried, as though written by someone who feared discovery even while holding the pen. You do not know the half of it. The lines replayed in his mind each night as he lay awake. He thought he had seen the worst of Patty Cannon's work, the shallow graves, the chains buried in cellars, the confessions of her captives. But this letter suggested something larger, something sprawling beyond his borders. The mark at the bottom, a crude sketch of a wooden chest, haunted him most. It was too precise to be coincidence. The anonymous writer knew details only Cyrus or Patty herself could have known. And if the letter was true, the graves unearthed in Delaware were only fragments of a far wider graveyard. The whispers south by. Summer rumors drifted north from Virginia and the Carolinas. Stories of free black families who vanished without trace, of children lured with promises of work, only to disappear on the road southward. Of wagons traveling by night, their cargo muffled, their wheels silenced with cloth. In Mississippi, whispers turned darker still. A planter was overheard bragging at a tavern that he had bought Delaware stock, men and women who had once been free. Another boasted of a network that delivered souls like tobacco, efficient, profitable, invisible. These were not the wild tales of drunks. They were threads in a web, and at its center had once sat Patty Cannon. But with her dead, who pulled the strings now? The fugitive's confession one answer came from an unlikely place. In October, a man was caught stealing horses in Maryland. Facing the noose, he offered something more valuable than livestock: information. His name was Thomas Laird, once a wagoner for Cannon's crew. Under questioning, he described routes that stretched hundreds of miles, from Philadelphia to Charleston, from Norfolk to New Orleans. Patty was the hub, he croaked, sweat dripping down his face. But she weren't the only spoke. There's men down south with more money than God, and they paid well to keep the trade alive. He named taverns that doubled as depots, farms with hidden cellars, ferrymen who rode wagons across rivers under moonless skies, and always, he returned to the same chilling phrase. We didn't end nothing when she died. We just passed the torch. The map of Bones Sheriff Houston spread Laird's testimony across his desk, sketching routes in ink. The map that emerged was grotesque, a lattice of roads, rivers, and crossings that cut across the nation like veins carrying poison. Every line represented lives stolen. Every junction was another trap where free men and women were caught and sold. Houston realized with a shudder that Patty Cannon had not built a solitary empire. She had built a template, and others had followed it. He thought of the letter again, the chest drawn at the bottom. Whoever wrote it had known. Perhaps they were part of the network still. Perhaps they sought absolution. Or perhaps they sought to lure him deeper into the shadows. Lydia's fury. When Houston showed the map to Lydia Smith, she wept, not with despair but with fury. All this, she hissed, her finger tracing the black lines. And people still pretend it doesn't exist. They think Patty was an aberration. She was the rule. This land is built on it. Her anger was a flame that would not be smothered. She began speaking in public, recounting not only her own captivity, but the larger truth, that slavery's hunger for bodies had made neighbors into predators and silence into complicity. Some listened with compassion, others with resentment. More than once men shouted her down, insisting she lied, that Patty's crimes were exaggerated, but Lydia stood firm. The earth does not lie, she told them, and the earth is still giving up bones. Cyrus in the north, meanwhile, Cyrus James had made his way to Pennsylvania. There, abolitionists sheltered him, offering safety and a chance at education. But safety did not quiet his mind. Each night he dreamed of Patty's voice, low and commanding. Each Morning he awoke to guilt that he had been her tool even as a boy. Yet in Philadelphia he found a new purpose. Abolitionist networks soon realized that his knowledge of routes, taverns, and ferrymen could serve not just traffickers but those working in reverse, to smuggle enslaved people north to freedom. Cyrus became a reluctant guide. He drew maps, not of chains but of escape, reversing the very paths he had once been forced to walk. And yet each time he marked a line on paper, he felt her shadow linger. Patty Cannon was dead, but her roads remained, and he was trapped upon them still. Through an empty cell back in Georgetown, Patty's old jail cell became an object of morbid fascination. Visitors whispered that her laughter still echoed in the stone. Guards swore they smelled her pipe smoke drifting from cracks in the mortar. One morning, a deputy found scratches on the wall that had not been there before. Crude lines shaped like boxes stacked one atop the other. No prisoner admitted to carving them, and no key had opened the cell since her death. Word spread quickly. Locals began saying Patty had not left the jail at all, that she lingered, marking her tally of victims even in death. Superstition grew so strong that the sheriff ordered the cell sealed. But whispers traveled faster than mortar, and soon, Patty's name was spoken in every farmhouse again, not with fear of her body, but of her ghost. The Southern Discovery. In January of 1830, news arrived that made Houston's blood run cold. Near Savannah, a farmer digging a new well unearthed a wooden chest. Inside lay the bones of a man, shackled, his skull cracked. The description was too precise to ignore. A chest, the same as those unearthed in Delaware. The same construction. The same grisly purpose. The sheriff realized the truth. Patty's method had traveled south. Whether by her accomplices or imitators, her signature lived on. And if one chest lay buried in Georgia, how many more lined the roads to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana? The weight of silence authorities in the South, however, showed little interest. A single dead man was nothing compared to the millions already enslaved. One planter sneered when questioned, "What's one more bone in a field full of bones?" Houston's frustration grew. He had fought to expose Patty's crimes, to bring light to a darkness ignored for decades. Now, with evidence spreading across states, he found the same indifference rising like a wall. It was not that people did not know. It was that they did not want to know. Silence, he realized, had always been the strongest accomplice. Lydia's warning Lydia. Sensing the community's fatigue pressed harder, she told the story again in meeting houses, in markets, in whispers passed down to children. "Do not think her death ended this," she warned. "Patty's body lies in the earth, but her work walks still. If we forget, we dig the graves ourselves." Some mocked her as hysterical. Others turned away, weary of horror. But among the younger generation, her words sank deep. Children grew up hearing of the tavern where chains rattled beneath fiddles, of the widow who buried men like seeds in her garden, and in their hearts they carried both fear and resolve. The mark of the chest by spring, more letters arrived. Always unsigned, always bearing the mark of the chest. Some described locations, a crossroads in Virginia, a barn in Kentucky, a ferry crossing in Tennessee. Others carried only warnings. She was not alone. She was never alone. Houston could not tell if they came from a remorseful accomplice, a survivor, or a cruel trickster playing on fears. But each letter deepened the sense that Patty Cannon's empire had never been hers alone, that she was merely the face of something vaster, older, and still alive. The Curse of the Crossroads. The land where Johnson's Tavern once thrived fell into ruin. Roofs caved, windows shattered, weeds strangled the fence posts, yet no one dared dismantle it. It stood as a monument to dread, a skeleton of timber and nail. Travelers avoided the crossroads altogether, detouring miles to keep from passing its shadow. Hunters claimed they saw figures moving behind its broken shutters. Children whispered that if you listened at night, you could still hear Patty's laughter, or worse, the muffled sobs of those chained beneath. The community renamed the place Reliance, as though a new word could sever the past. But maps carried memory, and so did the soil. The name changed, the curse did not. One stormy night, Sheriff Houston sat alone in his office, the stack of anonymous letters before him. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment, the black ink, sketches of chests seemed to glow like brands. A knock rattled the door. When he opened it, no one stood there. Only a small box rested on the stoop, slick with rain. He carried it inside with trembling hands, pried it open, and froze. Inside lay a single child's shoe, leather cracked and brittle, identical to the one unearthed in his own county months before. No note, no explanation, only the relic staring back like an accusation. Patty Cannon was gone, but her shadow, her network, was very much alive. The empire of shadows. The box on the sheriff's desk. Sheriff Joseph Houston stared at the eyewitness child's shoe in the box as rain drummed against the window panes. The leather was cracked, brittle with age, but the shape was unmistakable. He remembered the excavation months earlier, when deputies had unearthed another shoe from a garden grave. That one had belonged to a girl no older than 7, her tiny bones folded into a wooden chest. Now here was its twin, delivered not by shovel but by human hands. It meant one thing. Someone still walked free who knew the details. Someone still carried Patty's methods into the present. Houston slammed the lid shut, his knuckles white. The dead might rest. But the living carried her torch, the relentless letters. More letters followed, always unsigned, always bearing the mark of the chest. One read, "The tavern was not the only house. Seek the orchard 2 miles east." Another, "Patty taught us how to bury, but others taught us how to sell." The graves are only half the story. Each was both a clue and a taunt, a breadcrumb trail into deeper darkness. Houston could not ignore them. He ordered searches of nearby farms, river crossings, even abandoned barns, and time after time the earth yielded more bones, sometimes a full skeleton, sometimes fragments, men, women, children. It became clear that Patty Cannon's crimes had not ended with her. She had been the center of a storm, but the storm still spun outward, fed by greed and silence. Lydia's War Lydia Smith knew the truth before the sheriff admitted it aloud. Patty had been a face, not the whole body. She traveled from town to town, speaking with a voice that trembled but did not falter. She told the story of the chains, the darkness, the cries that still rang in her dreams, but her words were not always welcome. In some towns she was celebrated. In others, stones were thrown at her feet. Men shouted that she was lying, that dredging up horrors would only sow discord. Still, Lydia pressed on. "You may silence me," she said, "but the bones will not be silent. They will rise until you cannot bury them again." Her persistence carved cracks in the wall of denial. But cracks were not enough to topple the structure. Cyrus's burden far north in Pennsylvania, Cyrus James lived a life that was half freedom, half nightmare. He worked with abolitionists now, guiding fugitives along hidden paths, reversing the very roads he once traveled under Patty's whip. But memory chained him. At night he saw Patty's eyes watching, her voice whispering that he would never be free. Sometimes he swore he smelled her pipe smoke in the corners of rooms she had never entered. And then one evening, he received a letter of his own. It bore no name, only the mark of the chest. "You led them to the graves. But there are more. You know there are more. Come south, and you will see." The handwriting was different from the sheriff's letters. More deliberate. More personal. Cyrus burned it in the fire, but the words branded themselves into his mind. The hidden orchard, following one of the anonymous notes. Houston's men dug in an orchard 2 miles east of the tavern. The trees there were withered, their fruit shriveled as though poisoned. Beneath the roots they unearthed a trench filled with bones, not coffins, not boxes, but a communal grave. Dozens of bodies tangled together, ribs interlaced, skulls cracked. One deputy dropped his spade and vomited into the dirt. Another crossed himself, whispering prayers. Houston stood silent, his throat tight. It was no longer about individual murders. This was industry, systematic, calculated, endless, and somewhere, someone had known enough to point them here. The rumors of the South News of the Orchard spread, but with it came darker tales, that Patty Cannon had not been the worst of the network, only its northern node. In Louisiana, whispers spoke of planters who bought wagon loads of kidnapped people. In Georgia, rumors of ferrymen who drowned the resistant in rivers before selling the compliant. One story chilled Houston most. A plantation owner in Mississippi who kept a collection of small wooden chests in his attic, each filled not with bones but with documents, names of the free kidnapped, dates of their capture, prices fetched. A ledger of theft, written in neat ink. If true, it meant the network had kept records that might still exist, records that could prove, beyond doubt, that Patty's crimes were part of a much wider system. But no sheriff in Mississippi would pursue such a truth, for there, the line between crime and commerce blurred until it disappeared. The superstitions as the investigations dragged on, the land itself grew restless. At least that's what people claimed. Farmers near Reliance said their plows snagged on bones more often than stones. Children whispered that they saw faces in the windows of the abandoned tavern. Hunters claimed they heard chains rattling deep in the woods at night. Even deputies swore strange things. Tools misplaced, lamps snuffed by unseen hands, whispers carried on the wind. One man refused to return after he swore he saw Patty herself, standing in the orchard, her gray hair wild, her pipe glowing red in the dark. The fear became its own prison. People avoided the crossroads entirely. The soil, once fertile, lay fallow as if the earth itself refused to be tamed again. The sheriff's final visit, in the spring of 1831, 2 years after Patty's death, Sheriff Houston returned to the tavern one last time. The structure sagged, its roof half collapsed, the smell of mildew and rot thick inside. He carried a lantern and his pistol, though neither comforted him. He walked through the rooms where children had once laughed over meals, where fiddles had once played. Now the silence pressed heavy, broken only by the creak of boards. Down in the cellar, the air was colder. The iron ring still clung to the walls. Scratch marks still scarred the stone. Houston raised the lantern, and for an instant, he swore he saw them. Dozens of faces staring from the shadows, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The lantern flickered. The vision vanished, but Houston knew what he had seen. Not ghosts, but memory carved so deep into the walls it could not fade. He left the tavern without looking back. The twist of the chest years. Later, long after Houston had retired, another chest was found. This one not buried, but hidden in the rafters of a barn near Charleston. Inside lay not bones but papers, dozens of certificates of freedom torn and scorched, just like those found in Patty's attic. Names, dates, signatures, proof of lives erased and sold. Among them was one paper that froze investigators' blood. A certificate bearing the name Cyrus James, dated 1829, the year he testified. But Cyrus had never seen it. He had been freed, by the courts, not by paper, which meant someone, somewhere, had prepared to erase even him. The chest closed with a heavy thud, as though sealing the question forever. How many more names had been collected, ready to be burned? The legacy of fear. By the time the tavern collapsed into ruin and Patty's grave was paved over, her name had become folklore. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Sleep, or Patty Cannon will come for you. But for those who lived through her reign, it was no story. It was memory. And it was warning. Lydia Smith lived to old age, her voice never quieting. She told her story until her final breath, ensuring no one could claim ignorance again. Cyrus James, too, carried the scars until death, his maps and guidance, helping hundreds escape along the Underground Railroad, a reversal of the roads he had once walked. Yet neither could erase the truth. The graves were countless, the names too many, the silence too heavy. The final twist in 1961, when Patty's skull was displayed in a Delaware library. Curious children peered through the glass. One boy pressed his ear close and swore he heard faint laughter rattling from within the hollow bone. And in that same year, during construction near Reliance, workers unearthed yet another chest. Inside were not bones, but shoes. Dozens of them. Small, cracked, brittle with time. None matched the records. None could be named. It was as if Patty, even in death, had left a final riddle. A collection of lives taken, uncounted, unspoken. Proof that the full story was larger than anyone dared believe. Closing words: Patty Cannon's death did not end her crimes. It scattered them like seeds on the wind. Her methods traveled south, her silence was replicated, her shadow stretched across generations. We remember her not for justice served, because there was none, but for the questions she left buried in the soil. How many more were taken? How many graves still lie hidden? And most chilling of all, how many voices even now still go unheard? Because history is not just bones in boxes. It is memory. And memory, once unearthed, will not stay buried. And so, when you hear the wind whistle through the pines at night, when you hear the rattle of chains where no chains should be, remember this story. Remember Patty Cannon, because forgetting her is exactly how she lived for so long.